Right, so we're here with Michael Strong. Michael Strong is, among other things, the founder of some charter schools nationwide. He's written a lot about Socratic pedagogy, and he's also the chief executive officer of Flow, I believe that is, for entrepreneurs. Is that right?
Yep.
Great. So I really want to talk to you today about Socratic pedagogy, and part of the reason I want to do that is because when people read about it and they learn about it, it sounds like really interesting idea, really alternative, interesting alternative to what we normally do in schools. But I can also imagine some people having objections about, well, that's impractical to do. I can't do that within like the current K-12 structure, or I'm going into elementary and maybe it's not acceptable for certain grades or below. And I wanted to contact you because I know that you do a lot with Socratic pedagogy with students of, even as low as middle school and maybe elementary school age. So I know that you have an academy that you've recently co-founded called the Cabela's Strong Incubator, and looks like it has a lot to do with Socratic pedagogy. So can you briefly describe the school and what you do and how Socratic pedagogy plays in?
Sure. Just to actually go back to your earlier comment, I have used Socratic in Montessori schools with 3-year-olds, so I've gone all the way down to 3 years old and all the way up. So I can do it with any range of children. My present school, it's a new private school I founded in Austin, Texas with Kozo Cabelli, my co-founder, in August of 2014. We are both a college prep school as well as an entrepreneurial incubator where we train young people to be entrepreneurs. The college prep side uses Socratic extensively, including an hour a day from 6th grade onward of Socratic practice for every student.
Okay, so let's then start with the idea of Socratic practice. So by now, if people are watching this, hopefully they have some basic idea of what Socratic pedagogy is. But let's kind of talk about what do you think makes Socratic pedagogy the preferred model over, I guess, what Paulo Freire would call the conventional banking method of education. What makes Socratic pedagogy a more attractive alternative?
Sure. Well first, just in my personal experience, I had originally gone to Harvard, and I had known about St. John's College in Santa Fe, where all classes are taught Socratically. For 4 years at St. John's, all one does is reads classic texts and discusses them. The role of the tutor, rather than a professor, is simply to ask questions. And I loved it when I visited before going to Harvard. At Harvard, I was bored silly by having famous people talk at me. And so I left to go to St. John's, and I've never turned back. So for me, as a learner, first of all, I love to think. I want to be an active learner. Everybody talks about active learning versus passive learning. And I would say that learning is simply a lot more exciting, and it's much more likely to stick if one's mind is active. So if insofar as some of us are frustrated with learning being passive and ineffective, turning the tables and putting the energy on the student to talk rather than the adult is a great way to energize the students and also to get them to understand the material more deeply and for it to be retained at to a much greater extent.
I know in some other, I think another video I saw of you talking about the Socratic pedagogy, you compare the traditional method to a personal trainer who does the exercising for you, whereas Socratic pedagogy would be you're really doing it. And I guess the analogy is the student is really doing kind of the work of arriving at conclusions, developing arguments, things like that.
No, that's exactly right. I think one of the challenges is that when one is doing a traditional lesson plan where one stands up in front of the class and provides a song and dance, it looks like a lot's going on. And yet, at the end of the day, very often students don't understand as much as, no matter how brilliant your lecture was or even some of the activities, if the student's not actively engaged, not much is going on. And so I often find that teachers are inclined to begin with a little bit of Socratic, and then as they find more ways to get the students to think through the material on their own, they gradually shift more and more of their teaching to Socratic, because the students only understand things if they grapple it with their own mind. I'll give you one example. I was working with a high school teacher who had taught the French Revolution in her history classes for 17 years, and she was very experienced at it. I did a 3-week Socratic unit with her where for the first half of that period we would simply read and discuss Rousseau on inequality. And she was freaking out because it was incredibly slow. We weren't covering the French Revolution at all in one sense. The students were stumbling and struggling with Rousseau. What the heck is he saying? But at the end of that, they had really thought about power and inequality and, why these things have such powerful emotional tugs for us. And so then when she shifted to covering the French Revolution in a more traditional way, the students were really understanding why all this rage was there and why these people became so passionate about the French Revolution. It was no longer, sans culottes, blah, 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 blah. It was, wow, these people were angry. And some of the students had been angry in discussions about inequality and power and justice and things while discussing Rousseau. So you can see it as a way to get something inside them really passionate and excited about the content of the learning, and then kind of going through the material so that it means something to them.
Yeah, I see. It's so one of the objections that I could imagine people having to Socratic pedagogy is, well, that sounds great if you don't have learning goals that you have to meet by this date and that date. And of course, most K-12 teachers have something like that. So you said it seemed kind of chaotic at first because people are reading Rousseau and it doesn't seem like it's obviously connected to the French Revolution. So, so what would you say to people who, maybe the history teacher who is saying, well, that's great, but I have to get them to understand, this battle and this political aspect of the French Revolution by, 3 weeks from now, and I need to make sure that they do that. And, Socratic, towards that end, might seem a little bit more chaotic than some people are comfortable with.
That's a great question. And first of all, I would say every individual teacher has to do what feels right for him or her. So what might be right for one teacher may not be right for another. Again, as one develops as a Socratic teacher, one is capable of covering more material more effectively, and as one understands how to use Socratic within one's curriculum, one can use it more. I often encourage teachers who are interested in becoming more Socratic to look at their curriculum conceptually and use Socratic to really engage students in understanding concepts more deeply. Insofar as you say understand a history curriculum as a string of dates, there's no concept at all. But if you look at, say, the advanced placement world history curriculum, in order to do well in AP World History, concepts such as colonialism and imperialism and nationalism and power and government and inequality and religion and culture, these concepts are really important in order to do well on AP World History. So as one begins to try to consider Socratic education, I find that often teachers look at their existing curriculum and see where their teaching would be more effective if their students had a deeper understanding of key concepts, and then they kind of parse their curriculum so that they do Socratic sessions on the deep conceptual teaching and then perhaps accelerate the more didactic components of their curriculum so that they can both teach to the test as well as having students retain much more of what they learn. And the students tend to enjoy it better as well.
Great. So I'm thinking a really good application of this actually seems to be like, let's say, elementary or middle school math. Let's take the idea of fractions, and fractions and decimals and percents. So my own experience as a teacher, for instance, when I got to high school and I was teaching students who were in special education programs, some students didn't understand the relationship between fractions, decimals, and percents, and that they were actually the same thing in terms of the concept. They're just three different ways. So I'm just thinking, like, as a middle school teacher, what I'm hearing you saying is something like, so you might want to do some Socratic stuff that really brings home just the concepts of percents and fractions. So, like, how can we, how do we express, like, half of something? What are all the ways we can do this? And kind of talk about those things. And then once you're there and they understand the concept of what a fraction, percent, decimal is, now you can go on and do the more traditional, maybe textbooky stuff as kind of a supplement to that. Is that?
No, that's a great example. I do want to comment that of the four major disciplines, sneeze.
That's all right.
Maybe not.
Maybe.
It's on the edge. So language arts can be almost entirely Socratic. Social studies can be substantially Socratic. Science, somewhat less so, and math least of all. That said, your example is a great example of a math Socratic.
Okay.
So I often get math teachers to think of maybe one a month, depending on the curriculum, But often people don't understand how important it is to have students talk about how they understand things, including make mistakes about how they understand things, and think through out loud how they understand things. So I completely agree with your example. A different example in mathematics is more at the advanced level of functions and variables. Sometimes students simply see, oh, when they're introduced to an algebraic expression, now we have letters instead of numbers. Once you get to the point where the variable is actually supposed to vary such that you have created a function, that is obvious to some students but completely opaque to others. And simply to have students talk through what's going on in this equation, why do we have letters instead of numbers, that sort of thing. Some of the students will understand it pretty well, and it's good for them to be explaining it in different ways that other students understand it. Some students really may not understand it at all, but to hear how other students understand it will change their own understanding. In education, there's a lot of talk of metacognition. There's nothing better than to have students model metacognition. So one way to think about this is when students talk about how they're thinking and understanding things, the other students are modeling metacognition, and that can dramatically accelerate the rate at which other students learn.
So, so once we kind of apply this to elementary, you'd mentioned that you've worked with students as young as 3 or 4 on something like this. So I can definitely imagine someone thinking, well, I can't really do a lot of this with elementary kids learning language and math. So you've given some good examples of that. Are there any groups, either in terms of age or in terms of, I guess, academic level, that you would think that Socratic might not be appropriate for, and you would caution, either against it or with some alternative method?
Well, that's a great question. Sometimes there is that concern. The first thing I point out is if you go into a lunchroom, pretty much all kids talk. All human beings talk. So insofar as talking is natural, I think this can be appropriate for any human being who's capable of talking. I would say that different cultural groups sometimes have very different norms around talking. So for instance, at one point I was working with Native American students in Alaska, and they were just much quieter and more cautious about certain kinds of conversations. I still think it was very valuable for them, and the students really enjoyed it a lot. But depending on the cultural norms about talking, about disagreeing with adults, about contradicting each other, there are all kinds of ways in which the cultural background of students can vary the kind of the conversation. One big difference is, as I would say, a lot of children from some kinds of homes, often the working class homes, are not used to questioning everything in every direction, and so one may have to validate it a little bit more as a process. One may have to explain more why it's valuable. Often students from educated homes have seen their parents talking about ideas all the time, and this is just normal for them. That said, I would say precisely because some students do not see this model at home by their parents, I see this as essential for social mobility. The students that have never seen this kind of interaction are the ones that most need it if they're going to do well in college and in professional life. So I would say one should be culturally sensitive about the context, but that said, it's appropriate. Beyond that, it's appropriate for any student who can have a conversation.
Right, yeah. When you think about the things that are required to be successful in life, very few of them seem to match what we do in conventional K-12, where you memorize, you retrieve, you recite, it's on a schedule. I think you're right with the kids who get that the least at home may be the kids who need that the most at school to prepare them for anything like a real world. So
yeah.
So another question I had was, so when we read people like Freire and Bell Hooks and things about transformative education, even Maria Montessori and people like that, we think a lot about authority in education. And part of the problem that Freire saw with the banking method, where I tell you what you need to learn, I teach you on my schedule, and you retrieve to my satisfaction, is that in some ways it's authoritarian. Right? It's you're teaching someone, you're telling someone what they need to know. My job is to command, your job is to obey. My job is to profess, your job is to receive.
Right.
And of course, one of the really attractive things about the Socratic method and some other methods like that are that it's a lot less authoritarian. But some people, including myself, also have concerns that maybe the anti-authoritarian nature of Socratic methods may be overstated because, I mean, you can manipulate just as well with Socratic. And in some ways, it's more insidious when you manipulate
Right.
the Socratic method because you're allowing the person to kind of manipulate themselves. So I can have an answer that I want you to get, and my job is to pry that particular answer out of you. So what would you say about that? I mean, do you think that the kind of anti-authoritarian nature of Socratic is overstated, or do you think, and how would you deal with those authoritarian issues?
No, it's a great question. First, I would say it's actually a very subtle and complex issue. But two things. I mean, Socratic can be used to be deliberately provocative. It can be used to be extremely kind of Freire-like. It could also be used to be extremely dogmatic and manipulative. So there are a lot of different ways that one can apply it. I use kind of two approaches that I see as constraining in a healthy way. One is I like text-based dialogue where ultimately we're talking about what the text means. And so that way we're not so likely to get into a situation trying to manipulate you and your beliefs with respect to religion or politics or other things. The goal at the end of the day is what the heck does this text say? We've got a paragraph in front of us. I like to work paragraph by paragraph with difficult texts. Often I choose texts that are too difficult for any one student in the room to understand, but we work together as kind of a learning community to figure them out. And then I'm just constantly asking questions to see how we figure them out. I would say that I hope that the students get to an accurate understanding of the text, and I will focus in at an ever more granular level of detail to certain aspects of the text. What does this clause mean? Why is there a question mark here? What exactly does that term mean? If I believe they're off track on the meaning. So you could say that's manipulative. On the other hand, I've had situations where students come up with a meaning that I think is dead wrong. They insist on it, and I say, okay, fair enough, that's what you believe. And by the way, for the test, it's useful to say this, because I know they're going to get the wrong answer on the test if they go in their direction.
Right.
But the other thing I do that I think is really helpful is, and students and people I've worked with have talked about a lot, is when I'm engaging in a Socratic interaction, my goal is always to repeat what the other students said. I'm going to be a mirror. And so if you make a claim about what the text says, I often start by saying, so Kevin, are you saying blah, 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 blah? And what that does is that makes sure you and that I have validly understood your point of view and that I'm not changing what you're saying. And by means of that kind of mirroring, then if I have a different understanding of the text, at least I accurately understand what you understand it to mean. And I've found that if teachers don't do that, then they can be manipulative in a way that students find unpleasant. They're just always dragging them. But if I make sure they feel heard, then even if I keep saying, well, what does this word mean? Well, at least they know that I know exactly what they said. So that kind of, being sensitive about validating the students, and then if I don't understand, I'll say, am I understanding you correctly, or did I get that incorrectly? I'll put the burden of proof on me to be wrong instead of, you idiot. I didn't think, obviously no teacher would say that. But sometimes the tone is, come on, Kevin, get it, dang it.
Right.
But I'm like, am I making sense? Are you making sense? I don't quite get this. So the tone in which one does it, I think, is really delicate to strike this right balance between manipulative versus just, anything goes sort of things.
Yeah, I think it seems to be it's a delicate balance. I mean, having been a former K-12 teacher, now a college professor, it's one of the biggest challenges of teaching is learning to let go a little bit of a certain amount of control. You want X, Y, and Z outcomes, so you figure the best way to do that is to plan some sort of direct instruction where you can kind of control what activities students are doing and kind of what result they're going to get. And Socratic is a little bit fuzzier than that. You have to be more open to the idea that different people are going to come away with interpretations that maybe you don't think are correct, and you can interject that, well, that's not my interpretation, that's not what I get. But at the same time, at the end of the day, with Socratic, you kind of have to accept, to some degree, a relinquishment of a little bit of that control.
Big time, big time. The other side, though, is it makes it really lively and fun. I would say that I have a blast leading Socratic discussions because you never know where they're going to go. And they're a range. There's some. I've been with classes that are almost clinically depressed for a variety of reasons. Tough inner city neighborhoods where it's not necessarily happy and fun. But I've also been including in inner city neighborhoods places where it's just so energetic and lively and fun. And it keeps you on your toes because they're coming at you with all this sorts of stuff. And, it makes your brain really live to be engaged with students in this way.
Yeah. So I'm assuming most of the places you've worked with, students haven't really encountered a lot of Socratic dialogue before, at least in some areas. I'm sure it's kind of a new thing. And I know that research shows that students kind of sometimes will rebel at first against any kind of idea of where the teacher isn't directly giving the answers. So if you were a new teacher, or you were a teacher thinking about how to do this with a group that's never seen it before, how do you scaffold that in so that they can kind of transition into, okay, now I'm getting used to this, it's not so bad, it's more familiar?
No, that's a great question. First, I want to talk about a range of responses. I've had students on day one dig into this, have a blast, love it. And then I often debrief. At the end of the class, I go around best and worst of this conversation. And often students will say, the best thing was I got out of school today. So sometimes their perception is they didn't do any school. They kind of trick the teacher and BS the whole hour. Other times they'll say, well, this was annoying because we didn't really do school, and what about learning? One of the reasons I like to focus on textual interpretation is, and especially difficult texts, is then every student can see, oh, I'm learning how to read something that's hard. I understand why this is valuable. And occasionally one of the things I've actually done is had a Socratic discussion on, say, to take a passage from an SAT critical reading exam where we discuss the passage and then look at ABCD. Or maybe you look at ABCD initially, and certainly in middle school they're clueless because the text is so difficult. Then spend an hour in an open-ended discussion where it seems like we're just goofing off, but almost invariably most of the students will be more likely to understand and get the right answer at the end, simply because you force them to look carefully at the text. And I've done this enough with tests, even grade level AYP kinds of tests. Often one finds that the reason that students are getting wrong answers on tests is they're just careless readers. When you see how they construct meaning from a passage, and you see that they completely missed that clause or they completely skipped over that part of the sentence, and then they go through the answer responses on the test, no wonder they're getting it wrong. So you train them to slow down and think carefully about exactly what they're reading and what their logic process is in going from the readings into the responses. Very often that alone can improve test score performance. And when students see that, they see, oh, now I see why this is useful. I need to be paying a lot more attention when I'm reading.
Yeah, I can, the more you talk about it, the more I really think that I could see the applications even in elementary school with, you could bring in kind of math problems that maybe deal with things that students already know how to do, but kind of ramp up the level and actually kind of see if we can kind of work on it as a group, or in reading you can bring in passages from stories and kind of work your way through interpretations. I think you're convincing me and hopefully some readers that this method may be more applicable to earlier grades as much as later grades, because when we see it in college level and high school level. That's great, but a lot of these are elementary teachers, so.
And I would say, by the way, shorter periods in elementary. So when I talked about doing it with 3-year-olds, 5 minutes is a long time with a 3-year-old. By 4th grade, maybe you can do half an hour. By 5th grade, maybe 40, 45 minutes. So when I talk an hour, I'm definitely talking secondary. Early grades, I would say in 1st grade, 15 minutes is quite a long stretch. And the early grades, just to address that too, very often I'm just creating coherence in the conversation. Okay, Kevin said this, now Jane, you said that, Elora, you said that. Are those related or are they not related? And I'm just very carefully weaving together a conversation so that we're all participating in one conversation. Okay.
Great. So if you are a teacher who wants to try out some Socratic pedagogy, what kinds of things would you recommend they do in terms of starting out? How would you recommend they start out trying this and feeling it out?
So I encourage teachers to start with relatively small sections. So maybe schedule a relatively short conversation, maybe just 15 minutes, depending on the age group, and start with a text that seems very idea-rich. So there are lots of directions you go in. Start with lots of questions. Linus Pauling was once asked how he was so smart, how he came up with such great ideas. He said, I don't come up with great ideas, I come up with lots of ideas. People ask me how I come up with great questions. I don't come up with great questions, I have lots of questions. So I would say come prepared with way more questions than you think you'll need, a short passage, a short period of time, and see how it goes. And then, once, if it goes well, then you can add longer periods of time, more complex readings. You can play around the format in various ways. I would say as you develop as a leader, you can do more and more of it. My big concern is sometimes teachers try this, the first time doesn't go well, and they give up. If you can find a way to get it to work, it's great for your students and great for you as an educator in terms of keeping you alive and vibrant and excited about teaching. So try to look for small wins and then build on those small wins rather than say, I'm going to do all Socratics this semester, it's a disaster, and you run away screaming.
Right. Yeah, one of the things you said there was really true about making it, you really have to come prepared. I think a lot of people, when they see Socratic, they think, oh, the professor's really good at thinking on his feet, so he can do that. I couldn't really do that because I'm not great at thinking on my feet. Or I don't really have to come in too prepared because you just follow the discussion. It's, in reality, in my experience, and I'm sure in yours, you have to come even more prepared sometimes than if you prepare like a standard lecture or assignment or something like that. The second question I had to ask you, and then I think we'll finish up, is, okay, so if you're a teacher or professor, it sometimes happens where it'll go really well with one group, and then with another group, it's just it's not really going. So the tendency with a lot of teachers, especially new teachers, is, okay, I tried that didn't go real well, I'm going to back away from it, I'm going to do something else. How would you encourage teachers to kind of persevere through it, and what kinds of things can you change up if Socratic isn't going terribly well?
No, that's a great question. I would say, with talkative classes, very often it's an issue of getting one person at a time and kind of some structure. And so you can use conventional behavioral management techniques. You can do an inner circle and outer circle. You can have students raise their hand one at a time. You can put difficult students right next to you, and you can gently put your hand on them to get them to focus and so forth. There are a lot of, I would say, conventional behavioral management that can be used to control talkative students. The more difficult groups are those that are extremely quiet and resistant. With those, what I focus on is I try to make contact with one or two students initially. So rather than simply throw questions out there, discover that they're not going anywhere, and give up, I'll look for even some eye contact in students where there's some engagement. And sometimes in the early stage of a difficult class, I'll spend a lot of time drawing out one or two students very slowly and carefully. And then once I have relationship, an authentic, engaged conversational relationship with a few students, then I can spread it beyond. In some ways, an analogy I like is sourdough starter. I kind of get this one kind of going, and then I can pick it up and take it over to another part, because the students can be infectious. Once you have one or two students who are enthused about something, then I get the rest going. The other thing is, sometimes I'll use an in the text, out of the text technique, where if we're focused just on the text, it can be kind of dull and academic in the early stages. So I'll go ahead and ask provocative questions outside the text about life, typically related to the text, but if we're talking about a short story, do you respect this character? Nobody cares about the character. Okay. Do you respect anybody in life? Well, they respect somebody. Would you respect somebody if they betrayed you? Would you respect a friend if he or she betrayed you? And at some point you can get to a provocative question outside the text where, well, rah, 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 rah. Okay, great, I can work with that. Once you get that kind of energy going, then you gradually get the conversation on respect to a place where they're more engaged. Then you can go back to, well, and how about this character? You like him or not like him? That kind of thing. Right. And so I would say one of the things I really do a lot of is having these out-of-the-text conversations to get energy going, and then using that to dive back in the text once I've got the energy going.
Wow, that's great. No, I think you're going to convince a lot of people here that Socratic is a fun thing, it's a doable thing, it's achievable for all grade levels, all all age levels. It requires some creativity, but that's part of the fun thing about teaching, right? So, well,
Absolutely.
yeah, well, thank you, Michael, for taking time out to talk with us. I think students will profit from this, and I've definitely learned a lot. So, thank you again for kind of sharing your enthusiasm about Socratic pedagogy.
Thank you, and happy to hear from students if they try it, and let me know how it works.